As the kids finish up their Exodus, you can be opening your Bibles to Mark chapter 15. Since around the 15 or 1600s, suffering has been used as an argument against either God's existence or whether or not we should even serve him. Some people would say that how could a good and loving God allow the evil and suffering in the world? So if he does exist, he must not be loving and he must not be worth serving. Or maybe God just doesn't exist at all. And suffering and trials are the kinds of things that when people are going through and they're in the thick of it, there's not some snappy kind of thing you can say to somebody, some soundbite kind of thing you can say to somebody that's just going to make all of the pain evaporate. But of all the worldviews that exist in the world, Buddhism, Islam, Christianity, all the old pagan religions, the only religion that can say that their God came into the form of a man, lived sinlessly, and gave up his life for his creation is Christianity. And so therefore, Christianity has resources that are unparalleled in any other religion that teach us that God understands our suffering. John chapter 1 verse 11 says that he came to his own and his own people did not receive him. Imagine coming to those you created, and the very people that had all the predictions and the prophecies about the coming Messiah look at you and go, well, you don't really fit what we want. We want you to destroy the Romans. You're telling us to love our enemies. Let's just go ahead and have this guy pinned to a cross. Sometimes people will ask, where is God in the midst of my suffering? And the answer that Christianity can give is he's right next to you. He entered into human suffering and he knows all about it. And this happens all throughout his ministry, but perhaps the pinnacle of his suffering is this text that we're about to look at. And I want us to look at just the scene of the crucifixion. We're not going to look at his death in this lesson. We're just going to look at the moment that he's brought to the cross and when he's up on the cross and what's happening to him. So let's go ahead and read Mark chapter 15, verses 16 through 32. And the soldiers led him away inside the palace, that is the governor's headquarters, and they called together the whole battalion. And they clothed him in a purple cloak, and twisting together a crown of thorns, they put it on him. And they began to salute him, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they were striking his head with a reed and spitting on him and kneeling down in homage to him. And when they had mocked him, they stripped him of the purple cloak and put his own clothes on him, and they led him out to crucify him. And they compelled a passerby, Simon of Cyrene, who was coming in from the country, the father of Alexander and Rufus, to carry his cross. And they brought him to the place called Golgotha, which means place of a skull. And they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. And they crucified him and divided his garments among them, casting lots for them to decide what each should take. And it was the third hour when they crucified him. And the inscription of the charge against him read, "The King of the Jews." And with him they crucified two robbers, one on his right and one on his left. And those who passed by derided him, wagging their heads and saying, "Aha, you who would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, save yourself and come down now from the cross." So also the chief priests with the scribes mocked him to one another, saying, "He saved others, he cannot save himself. Let the Christ, the King of Israel, come down now from the cross, that we may see and believe." Those who were crucified with him also reviled him. There are many ironic things that are happening in this scene. And if you have taken literature classes in school, English classes, you know that there's different kinds of irony. The kind of irony that we're reading about here is what some people have called dramatic irony. And this kind of irony is defined as the irony that is inherent in speeches or a situation of a drama and is understood by the audience but not grasped by the characters in the play. In other words, as readers, there are certain things we understand here that the people that are the characters in this scene don't really have any clue about. And you can mark this out in a couple different statements. For example, the man who is mocked as king is in fact the king. In verse 18, in verse 32, they're mockingly calling this man the king. And we as readers of the Gospel of Mark know that Jesus is the king. John rolled out the red carpet for Jesus. There's been all this imagery about the kingdom has come, and Jesus is showing that he's got power over Satan and his demons. And so the Gospel of Mark has proven in one way or another, in multiple ways, that he is the king. He's the king that you've always wanted, and this is why it's the good news. But these people who are mocking him are not acknowledging the fact that he is actually the king, and it's ironic that what they're saying in their mocking of him is the thing that's actually true. Now, in a different way, would it ever be the case that we who identify with Christ and we who share in the same sufferings of Christ would ever be mocked in an ironic way? People will look at Christians and say, you're the unloving ones, you're the bigoted ones, you're the narrow-minded ones. And little do they know that it's actually the exact opposite. If you're going to follow Christ, expect the world to say things to you and about you that is just ironic, and they don't really understand what they're saying. Now, notice another ironic thing that's happening here is the powerless man is powerful. This man that people are rolling dice for to get his clothes, this man who couldn't carry his cross the whole way to Golgotha, this man who's being mocked and people are saying, come down now from the cross and we'll see and believe. He looks really weak in this text. But throughout the Gospel of Mark, he's been able to raise people from the dead. He's been able to take Mr. Withered Hand Man and have him stretch out his hand. He's been able to calm the storm. Look at how much Mark has already shown us that he's very powerful. So what's the truth of what Jesus is doing here? Philippians chapter 2, verse 8 says he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. What we're seeing here is not a man without power. What we're seeing here is a man with humility. Do you realize, and many of us realize this, that you've got a lot of power? You know those situations in your family or your workplace where somebody says something that you don't like, and you just know if you raise your tone in the right kind of way, or if you yell and you say certain kinds of words to that person, you're going to shut it down and you're going to get your way. Do you know what people who truly have power do? They humble themselves. And they don't take that power and the ability that they have to just get their way in every situation. And they say, you know what? I'm going to follow the path of Jesus, and I'm going to humble myself right now. And that's what actually takes true power. So in the moment that they're mocking him as if he doesn't really have power is when he's demonstrating his power. But notice another ironic thing. The man who can't save himself saves others. This is how he's mocked in verse 31. The ironic thing about this is that the only way Jesus was going to ultimately save people is if he stayed on the cross and died. But when they're calling for him to come down from the cross and show us that you can save yourself, you know, the same thing is true with us. Do you want to help people? Do you want to give life to other people? I like what Paul says in 2 Corinthians 4, verse 12, where he says, death is at work in us, but life in you. Death is at work in Jesus in this scene, and it's the means by which he will save other people. Now, if imagine there was a psychologist at the foot of the cross, and he has this interview with Jesus, and he says to Jesus, he asks him some questions, and he says, Jesus, are you helping people right now? Yeah, this is leading to the salvation of the world. So yeah, this is okay, so follow-up question. How do you feel right now? Do you feel on top of the world? No, it feels like death. Do you want to know how you help people? It means that you put to death some of your bank account. It means that you put to death some of your time. It means you put to death some of your energy and put it towards other people. It doesn't always feel like you're on the top of the world when you're helping people. Sometimes it feels like death, and sometimes that's the way that you know you're actually helping people. You ever felt that way before? How can all of these ironic things actually be true? And all of these ironic things be what we're actually putting our faith in? There's something in this text that is unique about the Gospel of Mark. The other Gospels will mention Simon of Cyrene, but only Mark's Gospel is the one that adds the sons of Simon of Cyrene, Alexander and Rufus. In the ancient world, so in our culture today, the way that somebody's going to write a book that you can cite the sources, there's going to be footnotes and like half the book's going to be footnotes, and then you really know it's academic and you're sophisticated if you read it and all that sort of thing. In the culture back then, how would you cite sources? Have you ever noticed how in the Gospels, one Gospel will name somebody that the other Gospels don't name, and thought to yourself, well, why is that happening? What's happening in passages like this is the original audience of Mark must have had access to Alexander or Rufus, and in the book of Romans, there's a man named Rufus. Maybe it's the same guy, but Romans 16:13, greet Rufus, chosen in the Lord. The Gospel of Mark probably written to a Roman audience. Can you imagine if this is the case? And in the first century, a church gathers together in Rome, and they get the letter of Mark, and somebody gets up and reads it, and Rufus is sitting in the audience with them, and they read the whole letter out loud. And when Rufus is brought up, everybody swings over and looks at him. And after the reading is over and the prayer is done, they all storm him and go, is that really true that your dad carried the cross? Yeah, that's right. You go read ancient literature, one of the ways that they would cite their sources is they would name drop somebody that the original audience would have had access to. Try to imagine then what's happening in this scene. As we looked at last night, Jesus would have been scourged by Pilate, and after all of that would have been done, the blood would have been dripping down his back, and they still call for his crucifixion, and the whole battalion is leading him to the governor's headquarters. And I used to think that in this scene that we're thinking of like maybe 15 soldiers are just kind of messing him around. A whole battalion is up to 200 people. So maybe picture a few more people, and they start to mistreat him. They put purple clothing on him. They take a crown of thorns, and they twist it together and set it on his head. And that's another ironic thing, because where's the first time in the Bible we read about thorns? In Genesis chapter 3, because of the effects of sin. And it's as if Jesus is taking the brunt of the curses upon him, and they're saying, "Hail, King of the Jews," striking him with this reed. I can't imagine 15 people spitting on you. Can you imagine 200 people spitting on you? And everything that's happening in this is an ironic way of calling him king. Here's your scepter. Here's your crown. Here's your robe. What would the spit be? Have you ever thought about that? How did kings get anointed back then? They'd pour oil on their head. Maybe the spitting is, there's your anointing, sir king. Everything else in this is an ironic way of calling him king. And this is fulfilling Isaiah 50 verse 6. I gave my back to those who strike and my cheeks to those who pull out the beard. I hid not my face from disgrace and spitting. And after they treat him in this way, they strip him of the royal clothes, put his own clothes back. You can imagine the blood and reopening the wounds from the scourging that he experienced. And now he's ready to go over to Golgotha. And in this time period, the vertical beam at the cross would already be there. What they would carry is called the patibulum, which is the cross beam. And Jesus has already been up all night. His back is ripped open. And he starts out by carrying it. We know in John chapter 19, verse 17, he went out bearing his own cross to the place called the place of a skull, which in Aramaic is called Golgotha. But we know that Simon of Cyrene has to end up carrying part of it as well. Can you imagine that? This man that's a passerby, and these Romans say, you carry the cross, and this guy maybe is the first time ever heard of Jesus, and he's seeing him right here, and he's the one leading Jesus to this place. And when they finally get to Golgotha, he's offered a narcotic, wine mixed with myrrh. No, I'm not going to take it. Why is this place called the place of the skull? Some people have said that if you go to the promised land, that the hill that they think he was crucified at looks like a skull, although not so much as of lately because of some rain or something like that has maybe affected some of that. So that's possible. It would also make sense that if this is the place where a lot of people are executed, there's maybe skulls there, something like that. But maybe there's another ironic reason it would be called the place of the skull. Do you remember back again in Genesis 3, the promise to the woman? That through your offspring, there's going to be somebody that's going to crush the head of the serpent. Where is it that the head of the serpent is being crushed, but at the place called the place of the skull? And in verse 24, it says it in just a few simple words. And they crucified him. And the original audience would have known what that meant. Likely taken all of his clothes off. They would have nailed it through the wrist to the patibulum, lifted the patibulum up to the vertical crossbeam, nailed his feet on there, and there he is, the King of the Jews. Well, he's up there. There's 3 waves of mocking. The first wave of mocking comes from the passerbys. You said that you'd rebuild the temple in 3 days. Come down now, take care of all this kind of stuff. Let's see how powerful you really are. What kind of person do you have to be to see somebody bleeding out on a cross and you mock them? The second wave of mocking is coming from an even more unlikely place. The chief priests and the scribes, mocking him to one another. Do you suppose that typically the priests are the kind of guys that would like to pop some popcorn and just go out and watch a crucifixion? I don't suspect that these are the kind of people that normally watch something like this, but here they are reveling in their success. Ironically again, though, what's the role of a priest? To oversee the sacrifices. And without even realizing it, there they are right there by the true Lamb of God, overseeing it. The third wave of mocking comes from perhaps the most unlikely source, and that's the robbers that Jesus is crucified with. Can you imagine? Everybody's against Jesus here in this scene. Everybody's turned in on him, and just like we see in Luke 23, verses 42 and 43, and he said, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And he said to him, truly I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise. We're going to see in just a moment that there's something else to say about this robber, but one of them ends up repenting. But here's Jesus, even while he's on the cross, being numbered with the transgressors. His whole ministry, he was a friend of tax collectors and sinners, and it's fitting that he would be crucified between people that are robbers like this. Now, with this scene before us, what are some of the things that we're supposed to learn about Jesus' suffering and our suffering, and how is this passage supposed to strengthen us to endure our suffering? Maybe one question we could ask is, why is Jesus suffering in this passage? What's the reason for it? And I think one of the ways that you can detect what the reason for his suffering is by noting what they're mocking him about. And that kind of indicates what they're frustrated about with him. But at the beginning of the text, hail, King of the Jews. At the end of the text, he's the King of Israel. Now, throughout history, kings have had the ability to make examples out of people. If you disobey, you can be made into a public spectacle. If you don't respect the authority of the king, then you're going to be in a lot of trouble. Kings carry authority like that. And when Jesus came and he was making claims, making it sound like he was the king, he didn't really have the credentials. He's from a city that nobody cared about. He didn't have the kind of pedigree that people would be concerned about that would make him fit that kind of mold. And the kinds of things Jesus was saying were not the kinds of things that they wanted to hear. Do you want to know if you really love God? You might agree with 80%, 90% of what God says. You're tested in the things that you don't like what God says. And in those times where he says you have to forgive that person, you have to sacrifice for these people, you have to remove bitterness from your heart, stop hanging on to your anger. When he tells you to do those things that you don't feel like doing, you're either going to respect his authority or you're going to go, why would he ever tell me to do something like that? And sometimes it takes the form of a brother or sister just simply telling you what Jesus already said, and then you do a character assassination on somebody who just told you what Jesus said, and you're really just rejecting the authority of God. These people didn't want to submit to the king. They wanted Jesus to come for political purposes and destroy the Romans, and he wasn't fitting what he wanted them to do. Do you come to Jesus expecting him to do certain things for you, and if he doesn't do those certain things, then forget him? This explains why people have such emotional reactions against Jesus. You ever had a time before you're at a restaurant, you're talking to somebody in the community, and you're just getting to know them, and then you bring up God, and every now and then somebody's going to be really upset about that. Why? Because I think people know that Jesus demands submission, that Jesus has ethics that he expects people to follow. In 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 3, he talks about scoffers that will come in the last days with scoffing, following their own sinful desires. Just this last weekend, I did some discussions at another church about modern skeptics and some of the reasons behind their unbelief. Have you ever had a time before where you started talking to somebody and they had all kinds of reasons why they didn't believe in the Bible or they didn't believe in God's existence, and you thought that the deep conversation to have was going to be all the reasons you do believe in God or all the reasons that you do trust in the Bible? There was one time when I was in Minnesota, and I was on vacation. Samantha and I were on vacation up in Minnesota when we were wrapping up our training here so that we were getting ready to move to California. And there was a guy that wanted to get together with me when I was there, and he had all of these reasons why he didn't believe in the Bible anymore. He had been converted up there, and now he's just had a crisis of faith, and he had all these things that he's read and saw online about why he doesn't believe in the Bible. And in that moment, I asked him, all right, there's really good answers to all of those things that you just asked, but let me ask you a question first, and please be honest with me. Is there something that the Bible teaches that you don't like? Guess where the deeper conversation was? Was it in all of the apologetics arguments about why you should actually believe in the Bible, or was it something going on in his heart that was causing him to mock, causing him to come up with all of these arguments? This explains our suffering. When you stand up for the Lord and you try to talk to people about the Lord and people hate you for it, it's the reproaches of Christ falling on you. Now, our personality better not add insult to injury. The gospel's already offensive enough. But if you've ever been trampled over because you're trying to tell somebody about the gospel, don't be surprised if the reason that you're being treated that way is that people just don't want to have to submit because they don't agree with everything that God says. The gospel's a gift. Salvation is a gift. But there are some gifts that are also at the same time offensive. Imagine that every year somebody at Christmas or your birthday, every year, started giving you breath mints and deodorant. And you'd go, thanks. And it was awkward the first year, but then they give you it the next year, and you're like, well, okay, tell me what's going on here. In order for you to receive and be thankful for a gift like that means that you have to acknowledge that, you might need the breath mints and you might need do you know what the gospel is? It starts out with saying, you are a sinner. You've messed up your life. You've wrecked it, and you need to submit to a God who's wiser than you. It's an offensive gift, but it's only appreciated by people who are sober-minded and realize that they need to let Jesus have authority over them. Other people are going to mock it. This is why Jesus is suffering. We don't want to have to submit to that man that's not doing what we would want him to do. Never mind the discussions on whether or not it's even true. I just don't like it. Now, go to 1 Peter chapter 2. And if Jesus is suffering in these ways for having done the right thing, it's one thing to suffer for doing the wrong thing. That makes sense. I shoplifted. It made sense that I got in trouble. But if you're trying to do the right thing and people are mistreating you, it's really hard to deal with that and to put up with it. But look what 1 Peter chapter 2 tells us to consider about this scene in Jesus' life. Look at 1 Peter chapter 2, starting in verse 21. For to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example, so that you might follow in his steps. He committed no sin, neither was deceit found in his mouth. When he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but continued entrusting himself to him who judges justly. He himself bore our sins in his body on the tree, that we might die to sin and live to righteousness. By his wounds you have been healed. If you were to read through 1 Peter, you would see that the audience is going through all kinds of suffering. The word sufferings is used like 14 times or something throughout the book. If somebody told you that, hey, there's a letter from the first century about a bunch of Christians that are suffering, what kind of suffering do you think would be what they're enduring? Probably like physical beatings, right? If you read through 1 Peter, that's not really what's emphasized in this. What's being emphasized is what people are saying about these people, being spoken against as evildoers. It's more the verbal kinds of mistreatment that they're receiving. And by the way, when Jesus is on the cross, that's the same thing that's being emphasized. It's not his physical pain, but it's what people are saying about him. And so this text is saying that one of the things you should meditate on when Jesus was on the cross is how Jesus handled himself when he was mistreated, when people were speaking against him, when people were reviling him. He wasn't reviling back. He wasn't making threats at all of these people. Why does this text emphasize so much what Jesus didn't say back? You know what Satan's low-hanging fruit is? Let's make somebody go through a pressure cooker, and the first place that they'll start sinning with is what they say. And Jesus didn't revile back. He didn't threaten. Why is he saying this in this context? Go back to verses 13 and 14 of 1 Peter 2. Be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether it be to the emperor supreme or as governor sent by him to punish those who do evil and praise those who do good. All right, I'm not going to ask for a show of hands because I'm pretty sure I know what the answer would be. How many of you believe that in the last 10 years of your life, the government has done something to cause you to suffer? Taxes, new laws being passed, something that has caused you some degree of anguish or frustration. And every time that happens, we as brethren are always really good about not saying anything about it on social media. We're really good about not ever complaining about it. We're really good at honoring those who have authority, right? We're always just awesome about that. And by the way, it should be equally applied no matter who the president is. If you don't like the president and suddenly you're finding justifications to not honor, but then when there was a president that you did like and now you suddenly care about honoring him, do you see how hypocritical you are with that? Why is Jesus' example of suffering being brought up in this context? Because sometimes the government causes you to suffer, but there's a way that you got to handle that, and Jesus' example on the cross is what we're supposed to meditate on. But skip down a few verses and look at verse 18. Servants, be subject to your masters with all respect, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the unjust. How about in your workplace? Anybody feel like you've got an unjust boss? Anybody feel like it's not fair that you haven't got that promotion and it's just nah. Satan's low-hanging fruit is your words. And you're supposed to think in moments that are that practical about Jesus on the cross and how he did not sin with his lips. If you take an orange and you squish it, what comes out of the orange? Orange juice. If you take a bug and you squish a bug, what comes out of a bug? Bug guts. One tastes better than the other. But the idea being that when you are being pressed in on all sides and you feel like you're going through a pressure cooker, the things that come out of your mouth, do you know what? It's not that the situation caused that. That's what was in your heart to begin with, but the situation brought it out. And when Jesus is on the cross, he's gold, inside and out. What kinds of things have been revealed in your life by the things you've suffered in the last few years? What kinds of complaining has it brought about? Has it caused you to think about Jesus' example and how he handled this? And maybe that's a question to consider. How did Jesus handle this? Psychologically, how did Jesus go through this in a righteous way? Look at 1 Peter 2:23 again. When he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but continued entrusting himself to him who judges justly. He continued entrusting himself to him who judges justly. Well, I thought that John chapter 5, the book of Revelation, teaches that Jesus is going to be the final judge that you have to stand before. So how is he entrusting himself to him who judges justly? When he was on the cross, judgment didn't belong to him in that moment. Eventually it would be given to him. And so he's entrusting himself that in this moment, it's going to be settled one day. It's going to be settled one day. It's not in me right now to handle this situation. If you have anger problems and you're always speaking out and complaining and it's always visceral kinds of words, it's actually, you don't have an anger problem. You have a faith problem. Your problem is that you don't trust that God's going to take care of it one day. One of the things that we've been doing in our household is on our refrigerator. We've had Samantha write, we according to Romans 2, it talks about people who store up wrath for themselves on the final day of judgment. So we have something on our refrigerator called storing up wrath. And we have got a little spot for each of the kids. And so if one of the kids mistreats the other kid and Samantha believes that I'm the one who needs to exercise, justice when I get home, she'll just put a mark next to the name. So let's say that my oldest son hurts my second oldest daughter. He hurts her in some way. And she feels like there's some great injustice that's been done against her. And then mommy goes to the refrigerator and puts a mark. Asher has stored up some wrath for himself. Do you think Abigail can sit there and go, you know what? I just experienced a lot of injustice, but it's going to be taken care of. I don't have to worry about it anymore. Do you know what's true about this world that we live in? Is daddy's coming home. Your father's coming home one day. And he's going to settle every injustice. It's not within you to exercise wrath on other people. Your job is to love your enemies. God's job one day is to have wrath on people who mistreated us. But our job is to love our enemies. This is how Jesus endured this. But there's one final reflection about what Jesus went through. In Hebrews chapter 12, there's another passage where we are directed to think about what Jesus did on the cross and what that means for our life. I have it on the PowerPoint here. In Hebrews chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. How did Jesus endure the cross and despise the shame? To despise something, you ever heard the phrase before? It's like water rolling off a duck's back. To despise something doesn't mean you go, ooh, I hate that. To despise something means that you think lightly of it. It's not really that big of a deal. And when Jesus was being mocked and Jesus was being mistreated, to him, he wasn't taking all of this really personally. For him, it was just water rolling off a duck's back. He could just despise it. But what was it in his mind that helped him do that? One of the things was, judgment's going to take care of this. But there's another thing here in verse 2, the joy that was set before him. What was the joy that was set before Jesus? Maybe part of the joy that was set before Jesus would have been like what he prays in John 17, may I be glorified with the glory that I had with you before the foundation of the earth. When Jesus is brought back to be with the Father, I suppose that would probably be part of the joy. I get to be back with the Father in all of his glory. But is there something that Jesus received through his suffering that he didn't have prior to his suffering? The church, his bride, you. When Jesus was on the cross, was he thinking, do you think part of the joy was, I'm going to have a bride, she's going to be made beautiful, she's going to be adorned, and it's going to be granted to her to be clothed in white in Revelation 19? I don't get this picture in the Bible that God is, okay, well, this is the spouse that I got to have. This is the joy set before him. Do you think that Jesus rejoices in knowing that you're his bride? The joy, so part of what he's thinking is, I'm going to have a bride through this suffering. Have you noticed how wired we are for stories about Prince Charming and he's saving the damsel in distress? We're wired for stories like this, and the ultimate fulfillment of that is Christ, who came to us, and we weren't a damsel in distress. We were an enemy of his. And even so, he comes and he dies for us and melts our heart. And while he's being killed by such people, he's thinking, these people could be transformed. These people could be made into my bride. And that's the joy that I'm looking for. And it gets us into a picture of what our joy is. If the joy set before him is us, the joy set before us is him. How much do you meditate on being with Christ forever? Face to face, no more tears, no more pain, no more suffering. It's all gone. And through the suffering, we're able to be with him forever. And I have to believe that while Jesus was on the cross, he started to get a taste of this joy. Remember the two robbers? And how one of them ended up repenting? You can just say it this way, that there wasn't robber, Jesus in the middle. How about this? Robber. Do you remember in Mark chapter 3, verse 27, when he talks about entering the strong man's house and plundering his goods? Jesus compares himself to a robber in Mark chapter 3. What Jesus is doing on the cross is he's plundering back what always belonged to him. He's taking it back from Satan. You know, there's a sense in which the true thief on the cross is Jesus, stealing the thief back from Satan into his fold. And the question for us to consider tonight is, has Jesus stolen your heart? Do you see that through his suffering, he can identify with you? Through his suffering, he was able to do that because he has joy in being with you. And if he did that for you, you can go through anything for him. He'll empower you to do that. By his wounds, we've been healed. And by his wounds, we should be loyal and be willing to go through the same thing for him as well. Lord willing, tomorrow night, we're going to be deviating from looking at the Gospels. We've been looking at scenes and themes from the Gospels during these lessons, but I want to finish this series of lessons tomorrow night by considering the life of Job. And we're going to see how Job has some parallels to Jesus as well. And we're going to tie these things together from the Gospels. But thank you very much for your good attention tonight. Again, it's been very enriching to be with all of you. It's been a joy to have these times together and the good conversations afterwards. I don't have any discussion questions for tonight. So I'm done. So I'm going to walk away.